Today we're going to look at Birkat HaGomel, the blessing we say in community after recovering from sickness or childbirth or other. We'll talk about exactly what is covered under the blessing. But before we do that, I just want to review a little bit last week, and especially the end of last week, since it connects well with the themes of this week. So basically, last week we looked at the blessing borei nefashot, the blessing we say after having a snack or drinking water or coffee. And we saw how it's very strange that we bless God for the things we lack. Borei nefashot rabot v'chesronan. And we talked about the different reasons we might actually give a blessing on the fact that we lack things. So we looked at a few different answers. One was sort of an ecological answer that it makes us all interdependent, not only us, but sort of all living beings. We looked at Rav Leo D, who talked about how lack is an opportunity for growth, that true happiness comes from growth. And that's where I wanted to get to Naomi's comment, but hold on, I'm just going to finish my wrap up and then we'll get there. And then at the very end of class, we didn't have a ton of time to look at them, but we saw how we saw Rabbi Alana Suskin, who talks about the blessing in not being self-sufficient, that the fact that we are not self-sufficient means that we can help one another. Okay, so she says, we acknowledge God and bless God for creating us in need because it allows us to help one another. What greater blessing is there than that? True brokenness is not lack. A lack can be filled. True brokenness is thinking that one is complete unto oneself and doesn't need anyone else. That tendency to think of oneself as self-sufficient leads to the desire to dominate, because the truth is that when one doesn't ask for help, one prevents blessing from entering from other people and from God. So I just wanted to read that again, since I think it ties in also to some of the themes we talked about in the first class when we talked about the blessing over going to the bathroom, and how there's a blessing in not being self-sufficient and being dependent on others. And it's also an opportunity to help one another. And then Rabbi Sachs says a similar thing, but more emphasizing diversity. He says, we thank God for making many different kinds of people and their deficiencies. So this was the Rabbi Alana Sunskin. And Rabbi, how come? The answer is, if we had no deficiencies, if we had no chesronot, if we lacked nothing, we'd never need one another. But because we all lack something, and because we're all different, what I like you have, and what you like I have, and the bracha borei nefashot rabot v'chesronan, many different kinds of people, right? He's sort of emphasizing the rabot and their deficiencies, is a bracha of coming together in our diversity to form a unity. To put it very bluntly, I don't need you to agree with me, I need you to care about me. Okay, so those were all the different answers that we saw. I think that all these themes are connected from these three classes. But I wanted to come back to what Naomi said at the end of class that we didn't really get to talk to, and leads right into Birkat HaGomel that we're looking at today, about growth from trauma, right? Naomi, that's what you were. Do you want to explain a little bit and say, and you thought that Leo Sachs was not talking about that. Actually, I wasn't so sure about that, but
Right.
Leo D, sorry. Yeah, you want to just say
And
a few words since we didn't get to hear you last time?
yeah, I mean, I'll defer to your greater knowledge of Rabbi Sachs and what he's writing that I might have misinterpreted. I was specifically, in that particular passage, seeing, sort of there was reference to, we need to be hungry so we'll be motivated to work, or we need to experience lack because it motivates us to do the things we have to do, which I see, that as being more like, yeah, you got to keep the poor hungry so that they'll work. And, if you give too much, and I don't think that's what Rabbi Sachs meant, but that was sort of, what I saw as the extension of that. The growth through trauma, but, I might have misinterpreted, but basically the growth through trauma, theory is just that growth doesn't happen automatically because you suffer.
Right.
But that some have found, research has found that the experience of the sadness, the pain, the loss, particularly if something like someone loses a child, or something that really kind of shatters your identity and you have to reconstruct it, that often what will happen is people emerge from that more willing to give of themselves, finding something to do that helps others. So, I think we've been talking about that. We have been talking about different aspects of that community, that way in which I lack,
Mhm.
so it wasn't really so different, except this idea that first you have to experience that pain, that shattering, and then you have to make an actual decision to
Right.
go through it, to become, to do something with that experience. So that's all.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think that's, I don't think he's saying it's automatic. You know what I'm saying? In other words, in all of these cases, also, also when we looked at Rabbi Sachs and Rabbi Alana Susskind, right? They're not saying it's an opportunity, right? The need or the lack is an opportunity. It doesn't happen automatically. The fact that we're lacking is an opportunity to do chesed, to help one another, but people don't all take that opportunity, obviously. And so too, there's Leslie. Hi, Leslie. And so too with the trauma, obviously, trauma can have many, many different, it can be an opportunity for
Right.
growth
And a blessing, which is, I think, where,
and a blessing.
that for some people, yeah.
Okay, so that segues into today's class. Mhm. Okay, so today we're going to look at the blessing of Hagomel, which, like I said, some of the more common cases where we say it is someone who's recovered from illness, a woman after giving birth, um, and it's normally said either in shul. It doesn't really have to be in shul, but it has to be in community. Um, so does someone want to, or I'll just read this part, but then I need your help reading other things. This is short, so I'll read it. Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, sovereign of the universe, who bestows goodness upon the guilty, who has bestowed every goodness upon me. So the person who has, gone through childbirth or recovered from an illness or whatever it is, um, says that blessing. And then the congregation, which has to be at least 10 men or 10 people, depending on, depending on your approach. But the congregation, the community responds, he who has bestowed goodness upon you, may he bestow every goodness upon you forever. So that's a blessing I want to look at today. Our main question is going to be sort of who says this and why. I gave a couple examples, I think, where we see it the most often, but there's a lot of more, a lot of cases where it's not as clear whether someone should say this or not. Before we start, any questions or responses or associations with this blessing that people want to raise before we
I
go into the
thought
sources?
you had to say it when you had an aliyah or when they were reading the Torah. Well,
So that is often the case, but like in an Orthodox congregation where a woman is going to be saying it, she's not going to be having an aliyah. So and a woman after birth, like I said, is a common one. So either she says it like from the other side of the mechitza, or she might say it at the brit milah or at the simchat bat, But anyway, the point is it doesn't. But also for a man, it doesn't. It is commonly said, like you're saying, with an aliyah, but it doesn't have to be said with an aliyah. It could be also for a man, like we just had on our street, someone had a surgery and he couldn't make it to shul actually because he had just had his surgery, but he wanted to say Hagomel. So, everybody, he called in all the neighbors and he said Hagomel just, at a set, like sitting outside his house, which is about as far as he could get. So it can be really anywhere. As long as, I said, you have the 10 people, the congregation. Yeah. Any other questions, responses about this blessing?
I have a question.
Yeah. Go ahead, Nancy.
So two of my kids got into a car accident a month ago. Um, they didn't want to think about it or talk about it.
Mm,
But I found out from the insurance company that it was a lot worse than they were willing to admit.
mm,
And there were injuries. So I was searching and I found this prayer, and I know that they're supposed to say it. I know we're supposed to say it in Minyan, but I just said it myself because it made me feel better.
There's actually a whole discussion of someone saying Hagomel for somebody else, and there is
Yeah.
precedent to it. So
Okay.
besides the fact that it was emotionally resonant and worked for you, which is also great, there's actually also even halachic like there's a question, should a man say it for his wife? Like it's there's also actually halachic precedent to do that. I mean, I don't know if everyone would agree or not, but there are sources and that's yeah. And I think it's something you can say for somebody else also, especially if it's someone like your children or your what, or your spouse who you almost as it were like experience some part of the I don't know, the trauma or however you want to put it with them, like it makes sense. We're not going to get into that
So,
question, but you can say I don't know for somebody else, but it's yeah. Was that Nancy?
Rachel,
Yeah,
Nancy,
go ahead, Nancy.
I'm just confused by who
Mhm.
bestows goodness on the guilty.
Yes.
And then that word is a little.
Yes, that's a very good question. We're not going to talk about it a lot, but we will get to it at the end. They're different. I mean, the Hebrew is chayavim, like those who are sort of obligated for something. Most people translate as guilty, or maybe undeserving is another way to translate it, which maybe sounds a little bit less difficult. But we'll get to it. Yes, it's a strange thing to say. I saw even some people who translate it more positively, like I don't remember exactly, upon the good or something like that. But I think that guilty slash undeserving is the probably most accurate translation, but it's a strange word, and we'll hopefully get to it at the end of class, or if anybody has any ideas, they're also welcome to. It's a very good question. So the source that sort of the main source for saying this blessing is in Brakhot in the Babylonian Talmud, which gives us 4 classic examples. Does someone want to read it? Rabbi Yehuda said that Rav said. So Rabbi Yehuda said that Rav said. All right, fine. I'll read this too.
I'll read.
What? Go ahead. Who said that?
I'll read.
Okay. Oh, Lily. Hi, Lily. Good to see you. Go ahead.
Hi. Okay, it says, Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, 4 must offer thanks to God. They are seafarers, those who walk in the desert, and one who was ill and recovered, and one who was incarcerated in prison and went out.
Okay,
But where
that's
do
all
we
we're going to read.
derive?
That's actually all we're going to read for now. So
Okay.
we'll get into the rest after. So those are the 4 examples given. So first of all, there's the question, is it only these 4 categories, or is it other situations that are similar to this? We'll see that there's a disagreement about that, though practically we interpret it that it's not only these 4 categories, but other categories that are similar. So what do all these 4 have in common? How would you? Meaning, if we are going assuming that we'll go according to the opinion that, yeah.
They're in dangerous situations.
Is that what, Leslie?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
dangerous situations. Okay, yes, exactly. Anything else anyone wants to add?
Rachel, I'm just curious if he added
Yeah.
that incarcerated in prison because of the word of the prayer itself about the guilty.
What do you mean? Oh, about guilty?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That was
that's a good
added.
question, and it does come out. Yes, when we get to the source that talks about that phrase "guilty," basically he ends up saying, we'll see when we get there, but like that. Yes, obviously the person who's incarcerated in prison is guilty. But like that in some ways, all of the examples are not really guilty, but undeserving in some way. Like the incarcerated in prison is the obvious one, like they're obviously guilty, but the other ones are undeserving in a like more, in a more subtle way. Yeah. But it could also be, by the way, incarcerated in prison and went out. Doesn't have to be someone guilty. It could also be, well, maybe, like certainly, I'm not sure what is the Hebrew. It could also be someone who is in prison not for, not for anything they did wrong. Like certainly
Could be
someone
the
taking
hostages that had to
Exactly,
flee.
like the hostages would also kind of fall under that category, and they did nothing wrong. Or many times throughout Jewish history, people have been imprisoned and they weren't guilty at all. But sometimes people are imprisoned and they are guilty, and they would definitely fall under the category. Okay, anything besides being dangerous that takes,
I see like
dangerous is like
elements of nature, like water,
That's
Some,
interesting. Yes,
yeah.
yes. And prison, maybe not, though. That's the one that,
Yeah,
but the other three, definitely nature. In other words, it's danger that comes to us from nature, at least the first three. Mhm.
Well, the first
You-
two also, you have control over whether you want to experience those. Go traveling, you have no control if you become ill or you're put in prison, per se. So
Yeah,
it's
so that's a very
agency.
good, yeah, exactly. So the question of agency is a very important one that we'll also come back to. So yes, on the one hand, you can choose to go to sea and you can choose to go in the desert. You don't choose to get ill, and most of the time, and you don't choose to go into prison, though you might choose to do something that will has a good chance will land you in prison. But okay. But on the other hand, even though you choose to walk in the desert or you choose to go to sea, you once you do that, make that choice, you lose a lot of control, right? Like especially back then, right? But here, even it's like walking in the desert, right? Like that's once you make that choice, then the forces of nature, as Lily pointed out, right? The forces of nature are like you lose a lot of control. So that's another question. So the balance of what we control in life and what we don't control in life, I think, is a very key theme in this blessing. Um, yeah. Anything else that people see in terms of? Well, let's look. We're going to look now. So basically, the whole Gemara. We're not going to actually read the Gemara inside. But basically what happens, but basically all four of these categories are taken from Psalm 107. So the whole the Gemara is like going from where do we derive each of these categories, and then it lists verses from this psalm. So instead of reading the Gemara, we're actually just going to read the psalm. And we're not going to read the whole thing, but we'll just enough to get a sense. And I think that reading the psalm sort of brings up other aspects of these situations. Certainly, yes, the danger is there, but I think it's also more than that. So it starts, praise the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love is eternal. Thus let the redeemed of the Lord say, those he redeemed from adversity. Okay, so we'll read the first couple of categories. Does someone want to read? Some lost their way in the wilderness. That's the one walking in the desert. Someone want to read it? The psalm?
I'll read it.
Yeah, go ahead, Linda.
Praise the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love is eternal. Thus let the redeemed of the Lord say, those he redeemed from adversity, whom he gathered in from the lands, from east and west, from north and from the sea. Some lost their way in the wilderness, in the wasteland. They found no settled place. Hungry and thirsty, their spirit failed. In their adversity, they cried to the Lord, and he rescued them from their troubles. He showed them a direct way to reach a settled place. Let them praise the Lord for his steadfast love, his wondrous deeds for mankind. For he has satisfied the thirsty, filled the hungry with all good things.
Okay, so that's the one about wandering in the desert. We'll look at one more example and then we'll see if what we can see from the language of the Psalms. So keep going. Some
lived in deepest darkness, bound in cruel irons, because
which here you can really see like the hostages is really.
Yeah. They defied the word of God, spurned the counsel of the Most High. He humbled their hearts through suffering. They stumbled with no one to help. In their adversity, they cried to the Lord, and he rescued them from their troubles. He brought them out of deepest darkness, broke their bonds asunder. Let them praise the Lord for his steadfast love, his wondrous deeds for mankind, for he shattered gates of bronze, he broke their iron bars.
Okay, so what else, in the words of the Psalms, what else do we see besides the fact that they were in dangerous situations that sort of that could describe these situations? And similarly, if you keep going, you're welcome to keep reading to yourselves. Similarly with the other two examples of the fools who suffered for their, that's actually, they learn from someone who's sick, all food was loathsome to them, and others go down to the sea in ships. What do we see about these?
But they were all redeemed.
Yeah, they were all redeemed, right? You can only say it once they're redeemed. For sure. Yeah. And what else? Like, what about
It's
Well,
not
in
the way
their
that
adversaries,
Yeah, Nancy?
I was just going to, in their adversary, they look to God.
Right, right. That they turn to God in the difficult
God.
situation. Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical danger. I mean, reading this, it
Yeah.
seems more like could be a spiritual darkness, or somebody could be really depressed, or, it doesn't have to be like they're out at sea and they're going to drown kind of situation. It's just they've lost their way in some way.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Here, if you look at the verses, it's not all about being dangerous. I mean, these are all dangerous situations, but like the verses are more focused on the suffering, which, like my mom said, could be spiritual suffering or, emotional suffering. Right? Hungry and right, they found no settled place. Their spirit failed. Here about he humbled their hearts through suffering. They stumbled with no one to help. Right? There's also something in the experience itself. Like you can ask the question, like, would somebody who was in danger and didn't know it, should they say Hagomel? Right? I don't have, I mean, I'm not gonna, not really giving answers to these, right? But like that would be an interesting question because they're lacking this, like the verses seem to be talking about someone having the experience of suffering, and maybe not even physical danger also.
They're also all in some kind of wilderness, not in a settled, civilized community kind of.
Yeah, that's also a very interesting point, especially when we think about the fact that we say this blessing in community, right? Like there's some aspect of this blessing that is about being restored, like about being in some kind of isolated, some kind of experience where they're isolated from the community, even in illness, like in some ways, right? Even if we're still living in our homes, we're often isolated from the community in other ways, or just
And
because we're
also,
having very,
like it says, to reach a settled place, and in Hebrew, ir moshav. So it's like miyushav, yishuv adat, like to be somehow settled when you're unsettled.
oh, right. So that's even the more emotional aspect, right? So, like, on the one hand, right, so we're making a blessing for God for restoring us to community and also maybe restoring emotionally us to a more settled place. You're saying not only actually being in community, but feeling more settled emotionally after being through this experience of not being settled, right? Like we saw it also like in our first in the first class when we talked about the person who had some kind of illness where they couldn't go to the bathroom and then all of a sudden it was restored to them, right? And they were like blessing God. Um, yeah, but here also could be if the experience is more of a psychological unsettledness, right? It could also be restoring us to a emotional settledness. So, oops, I wanted to see actually. I'm going to skip even though it's not the order, since this is what we were just talking about. Someone want to read Rav Aaron Lichtenstein talks about this.
Rachel, I was just going to add one more thing.
Yeah.
On all those cases, 4 cases,
Mhm.
at the beginning about, they're all what's the word, solo situation. You're taken
Exactly.
away from the community. All of those
Yeah.
situations.
Yeah. I think that's
And
very important. Yeah, exactly. And then when
now,
you
and
recite a blessing, you're reciting it in the
right,
community. Yeah,
exactly. You're being
definitely.
brought back to the community.
Yeah, exactly. Well, actually, we'll save Rav Aaron. We'll go in order. We'll go a little bit more in order. So the Shulchan Aruch, the late medieval legal
Oh,
code.
mhm.
So first of all, he says that it's not only these four, right? Someone want to read here, not just these four?
Very sure.
There are 4 classes of people
Here,
who
no,
have to
start at
offer.
well, we're gonna not go in order, actually. We're gonna start in the last paragraph, not just these four, but rather the same.
Um,
Could you
okay, yeah,
scroll up?
Oh, okay, that's it
yeah,
here.
not
Okay,
just
good.
these 4, but rather the same applies to anyone on behalf of whom a miracle has been performed. For example, where a wall collapsed upon him, or he was saved from being trampled or gored by a bull, or a lion found in the city threatened to tear him to pieces, or if thieves came and they were night bandits and he was saved from them, or anything like this, they all must recite the Hagomel blessing. And some authorities say that Birkat HaGomel is recited only by those four categories of people.
Okay, so first of all, there's a dispute, of course, like we said, over whether it's only these four categories or also similar situations. The Shulchan Aruch himself, right, Rav Yosef Karo seems to say, he seems to be on the side that it's not only these four, but interestingly, the cases he brings, how would you characterize them?
Physical danger.
Yeah, here it's physical danger, right? He's not necessarily talking about like what we saw in the Psalms that we'll come back to about the isolating experience and the experience of, though I imagine it's also experience of distress here, but but he's less talking about that. And certainly like these are also situations that happens to him in the city or, in a normal, in a settled place. And then he brings in another interesting dispute about what's sick enough to say Hagoma. Okay. So so Dad, you want to go back up to in every case of illness?
In every case of illness, a blessing must be recited, even if it is not a dangerous illness or a deadly wound. Rather, whenever a person was bedridden and he recovered, he recites the blessing because it is as if he had been taken up to the gallows for judgment. And there is no difference between one who has a fixed pain, which afflicts him from time to time, and one whose pain is not fixed.
Okay, so that's sort of Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, is like the classic Sephardi posek. So that's like the Sephardim a lot. I mean, we'll see what happens nowadays, but at least, historically went in that direction. And then the Ramah, who brings the Ashkenazi opinion, what does he say?
So some authorities say that a blessing is recited only over an illness that involves danger, like a deadly wound.
Okay, so question is, so the Ashkenazi opinion here is it's only an illness that involves a danger. And Rav Yosef Karo, the Sephardi opinion here is even something that's not dangerous, okay? And he says whenever a person was bedridden and recovered, but the Rav Hai Gaon, who's even an earlier source, actually goes even further, and he says even a person who had a headache or a sore throat, it was customary to recite Hagomel blessing following the Torah reading. Going back to Linda's question also about the Aliyah, it is, even back then, it was also said often as part of the Torah, the Torah service. Okay, so based on what we've been talking about, like the Ramah's opinion, I think, is obvious. Like that was all, that's also what we're used to, right? But, and that was like the most automatic answer of what all these four have in common is that they're all dangerous. But how do we explain the person who doesn't have a dangerous illness, or even the person who has a cold, possibly? Like, why would this person have to say Hagomel?
Things could always deteriorate and get worse.
Okay, so that's first of all a very good point, and we'll see a source that talks about that in a minute, and especially back then, right? They didn't have the medical knowledge that we had. They didn't know that it was a cold and not, I don't know what, pneumonia, or bad pneumonia, and they didn't have the antibiotics to treat pneumonia if it was pneumonia, so a cold could kill you. Like, who knew, even that's obviously true to a certain extent now as well. But back then it was all the more so. And I think also the wording a little bit, because it is, if he had been taken up to the gallows for judgment, how do people read that? I think that also a little bit hints to what Reba was saying.
Like he could die from it, and then he would go before God and have to be judged for his life.
Yeah, or maybe even that he's being judged now. In other words, he has the cold and God is judging whether this cold is going to end up killing him or not, you know?
Mhm.
But either way, right? It's like there's some kind of like life and death situation even in this cold. So that's one direction. What could be another direction maybe of why maybe not someone who has a cold, but whenever a person was bedridden and recovered, like what else might they have to say to go now?
Well, I think it reminds you of the fragility of life, and it's another reminder to be appreciative, even if you didn't think
Yeah,
of it yourself.
yeah, definitely. Or like what we were talking about earlier about the lack of control, right? It's a reminder, I have all these things planned and I got a cold and I have to just lie, and I'm not worried about, whatever, not worried about, being dangerous, but but everything, all my control, my plans and like my controlled version of my life have to a little bit be upended.
Also, are you
Yeah.
like in a fragile state, like a very vulnerable spot?
Oh, wait, you went out a little bit, Lily, but I heard very
I'm sorry,
vulnerable.
like you're vulnerable in a vulnerable position.
Yeah, that's like being put in a vulnerable position where you're not, maybe you have to also to get back to what we were talking about earlier, have to accept help, right? That you're not able to, you're vulnerable in a way. Yeah, exactly. Um,
So I was thinking, I don't know
yeah.
if this makes sense, but like if you
hmm
have a cold or a headache, stomach ache, it's something that you probably have, not often, but more than once during a year. And like if you keep saying having to say that bench going, maybe it loses its power
So
or
yes, I think
it's
you're
taken
right.
for granted.
Yes, and I think that's why in the end we don't go according to that opinion. I don't know, maybe if they ever went according to, maybe they did, maybe Rav Hagon presumably did go according to that opinion, but we're going to see that later, that like part of the power of a gomel is that it's something unusual. And it's not about a cold or like, I don't know, people who get headaches, like like you say, you get headaches a lot, like you're going to say one every time you get it, like it would lose its power. And we're going to see that later and why we ultimately nowadays don't rule like that. That Hagomel is supposed to be something not routine. Taking out of the, like we talked about before when we were looking at the Psalms, like taking you out of your community, but it's also like taking you out of your routine, right? A situation that is abnormal. So that's a very good point. Okay, let's move forward a bit. Sir of Liechtenstein. Sir of Liechtenstein, going back to how we were reading the Psalms. But also, I think it does a bit explain why a sickness that's not dangerous would be a cause to say Hagomel. Maybe not a cold, but a sickness that puts you in bed. So someone want to read? So Reb Lichtenstein was the head of Yeshivat Har Etzion, who died several years ago. Someone want to read? Someone want to read? It may have been argued.
I can read it. It's my
Okay,
daughter-in-law's
thanks.
maiden name. So in honor of Liechtenstein, I'll read it.
Oh, really? Pressure.
So it may have been argued that the blessing was not instituted because of what might have happened, but rather because of what actually happened. In the 4 cases described by the Gemara, the various people experienced troubles and suffering, and their lives have been put in danger. The wording of the Gemara, and even more so the verses cited therein, imply that the suffering and difficulties of the various events are what obligate the blessing. The Gemara troubles itself to emphasize the fact that those who had crossed the sea were mounted up to the heaven and went down to the deeps, and those who were released from prison sat for many days in darkness and in the shadow of death. If what we say is correct, then the obligation to recite a blessing does not stem from the danger itself, but from life lived in the shadow of distress, difficulty, and fear.
Right. So some interesting sort of practical implications of this position, right, would be number one, if you were in danger but you didn't know it, right? Then according to Rav Lichtenstein, you wouldn't say the blessing. Trying to think of a good example. Doesn't come to mind. Another one is if you're, the doctor finds a tumor, you're very, very afraid what the tumor could be, and then you find out that the tumor is benign, right? So in that case, there was never any danger, but you didn't know that, right? So and you probably feel thankful also, like, thank God, I thought my life might be in danger and it's not. So according to Lichtenstein, you would say the blessing. You weren't in danger, but you went through an experience that where of distress, of life lived in the shadow of distress, difficulty, and fear, and a very scary experience, right? Yeah. Okay.
So therefore, like, people used to say years ago, whenever they flew, across the ocean or something, they would say Hagomel. But now people who fly, every few weeks or something, and people just don't really do it anymore. It's not like they were, went through any suffering or distress usually.
Right. Well, so there's two pieces of that question, right? That's the classic question. There are still people who say Hagomel after flying. But there's two parts of that question. One is like, does someone who fly, I mean, there are a few parts, right? One is, does someone who fly nowadays experience any distress? I mean, yes, some distress, but not necessarily. Second is it dangerous, right? Now, it's not really more dangerous than drive. Certainly in Israel, it's much more dangerous to drive. But I think anywhere it's more dangerous to drive now than to fly. And then the third, what Nancy, it was you, right, mentioned about the question of routine, right? Like once it becomes something that you do a lot, or at least regularly, then maybe it doesn't make sense to say Agomel, right? But I think originally, right, when people started flying, right, it made sense. And some people have continued that tradition of, I've heard also the opinion that like someone who's flying, it's like you're in a situation that human beings shouldn't be able to be in, right? Like it's like, even though it's not actually dangerous, it like feels like it should be, Like it's like, how can human beings be up there in the sky? Like, and one should say a gomel just for that, because like you're in such a, I don't know, in some ways inherently dangerous situation, even though it isn't actually dangerous. I mean, maybe also someone who, yeah, was you, what someone want to say? Reva, was that you?
I was
Yeah.
just gonna, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I asked our rabbi toward the end of the pandemic whether we should all be saying Hagomel, because in a way we were all in danger. And he said, well, no, I mean, he really did have COVID, and he felt that he was the one that should be saying Gomel, but not the rest of us, because the rest of us weren't really in all that much danger.
That's not true.
Right. So that's again the same question, right? Because yes, maybe you didn't get COVID and you weren't actually in danger, but you had the experience of being very, very scared and being isolated from society. When we talked about that, right? We all were isolated from, some of us were more scared than others, but we were all pretty much isolated from society. So according to Rav Lichtenstein, I don't know what he would have said, but maybe there would be room for someone who didn't actually get COVID at a time that COVID was, was dangerous or in a dangerous way, but or maybe even didn't get COVID at all, but went through. But that would be interesting because it would be like a communal hagomel. Like we all went through that experience. Interesting. Like everybody says it and responds. I don't know. Yeah, Mom, did you want to say something?
How much does the fear factor into it, going back to the plane? I mean, there's some people who are really phobic of planes. So why wouldn't they say Hagomel each time? Because they're like freaking out each time.
Yeah, so someone like that, maybe they would. And maybe also someone like that doesn't fly every few weeks,
Probably not, because they don't want
So
to.
maybe they fly once a year when they really have to, when there's a really important reason, but they're really, really scared. And yeah, for sure, I think. Meaning, Rav Lichtenstein brings in the subjective aspect. So according to that, yes, somebody who's really scared of flying would have more reason to say a gomel than someone who just does it as a matter of routine. Yeah, Naomi, go ahead.
Just along those lines, I guess it just seems to me that it's very hard to to develop a halachic rule from the subjectivity, and in general from these four categories. Because, one person, two people would both be ill in the same degree, but one would fly in the same degree, but one would do one wouldn't. Which is fine if it's just a matter of do you feel like it, but becomes complicated if it's do you have an obligation. And along the same line, someone who serves a prison term because they did something, there's a lot of, or just, who wasn't feeling very ill, and didn't, but didn't feel it. So the subjectivity definitely seems to be problematic, but I think also just, what does it mean to cross a desert? If you go on a cruise, is it the same thing, as if you were really during the cruise? So even aside from the subjectivity, there's the question of what experience of being crossing a sea or whatever. I'm having trouble sort of figuring out how we figure out what is benching Gomer really.
Right. Right. So that's always a question in halakha, I guess, is how much to take into account the subjective experience, because once you take into account the subjective experience, the rules are not as clear as they would be otherwise. And either you decide yourself or you ask a rabbi, but it becomes more complicated. So some people would say, want to make it just more clear, not having to do with the subjective experience. But yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Yeah, let's keep going with Rav Melamed, because he also, I think, well, he talks about what Nancy was talking about the special cases, but that's actually a criteria that is a bit more objective. Like what Naomi's saying, if it's really about the subjective experience, how do we decide? But if one of the criteria at least is whether it's sort of special and unusual, then that at least is somewhat, I mean, you have to decide how unusual, but it is a bit of a more objective criteria, but also has a subjective aspect, obviously. So someone want to read Rav Melamed? He's a current sort of halachic giant today living in Israel.
Yes, I'll read him. Yeah.
Yeah,
And even though the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch states that every patient who is cured should recite Hagomel, this is because in the past, every person who fell ill was considered to be in a somewhat dangerous situation, because many times they did not know whether it was the flu or heart disease, if the patient had angina, or was a diabetic patient who was in a dangerous condition. And as we sometimes find in stories from the past, people who functioned as perfectly healthy fell ill suddenly and died the following day.
Right. So that's what Reba was talking about, right? That we don't know where sickness can lead. Yeah, keep going, Dina.
Okay. I just need you to scroll up, down. Therefore, after medical science has developed, and it is now possible to diagnose a patient's condition and determine whether there is danger of his illness, the members of all communities, both Sfaradim and Ashkenazim, should be instructed to recite the blessing only after an illness that had a certain danger. And the sign is that this is a disease that is permitted to violate the Sabbath in order to save the patient.
So he makes it much more objective, right? There are certain sicknesses which,
Right.
and in Magnum is giving birth, right? You don't have to call it a sickness, right? But you're allowed to violate Shabbat in order to even to help the patient, right? So that's much more, objective criteria. Yeah.
Not just permitted, but you have to, right?
Right.
If it's
Exactly. Right.
It should be added that the Hagomel blessing is intended for special cases and not as a routine blessing. Proof for this is that some say that anyone who needed to recite Hagomel in the times of the temple should have had to sacrifice a korban todah, Thanksgiving offering.
Okay, so he brings it, unlike the Rev Lichtenstein direction, though I'm not sure if Rev Lichtenstein would have taken it into, how exactly he ruled practically, but in terms of the practical ruling for Rev Melamed, he takes it back a little bit more, makes it a bit more objective. And he says about the airplane nowadays, we don't say a gomel on flying because it's become routine, though he says that someone who doesn't fly and who experiences those very, he does actually say that there could be, if someone doesn't fly often and it does experience it as a, difficult, distressing thing, or then they maybe would say it, but in general, he says we don't say on flying because it's intended only for special cases. And he brings this interesting point that I think also sheds light on like what we're doing with Hagomel, is that the Gomel is connected to the Thanksgiving offering that they gave in the temple. Rashi says that the Psalms, remember we saw it said, and let them, these four categories of people, sacrifice the sacrifice of thanksgiving, right? So these four cases were also the four cases where they would bring a Thanksgiving offering. And so obviously Rav says, that's not something that was done frequently. That was not a routine thing to go to the temple and bring a Thanksgiving offering. You only did that if there was like a really good reason. And just I had to bring this since we're talking about the Thanksgiving offering and thinking about like what the meaning of Hagomel is, if it's connected to the Thanksgiving offering, is that according to the Midrash, and Vayikra Rabbah talks about that, how once in the time to come, all sacrifices will be annulled, but the sacrifice of thanksgiving will not be annulled. All prayers will be annulled, but the prayer of gratitude will not be annulled. So in other words, somehow, like there's something very, very essential to Judaism and to life, right? About the Thanksgiving sacrifice, and maybe also prayers of Thanksgiving, that even when other sacrifices we don't do anymore, we'll still do the Thanksgiving sacrifice. All right. So our last 10 more minutes, and I also want to talk a little bit, just wrap up for a few minutes at the end. So what are we? So why are we saying this blessing? Like based on all this, like this here, like we talked a lot about who says the blessing, which of course touches on why we say the blessing. But what are we like? What sort of experience is saying the blessing, or what message is it giving us, or what is why do the rabbis institute this blessing for these four situations, however you want to interpret them, like based on what we've been talking about. And why in community is another interesting question.
Well, it reminds us that that everything comes from God, and that if something good happened, we have to appreciate that and thank God for having that experience and coming out on the other side. So it's another way of reminding us and reminding the whole community, because everybody will see that you're making this blessing, and they'll ask what happened, why are you doing it, and so it gets communicated to other people at the same time.
Yeah, but by saying the blessing in community, everyone else is also getting the message of sort of their dependence on God, and another thing that is another advantage also, just practically, that when you said it reminded me, right, that when we go up and say the Hagomel blessing, that people might not have known we were sick, and certainly might not have known that we were in a car, that someone was in a car accident, or like was it Andrea that talked about it at the beginning, that her kids weren't in a car accident, right? And maybe you didn't want people to come up to you, Andrea, I don't know, but that's another thing, right? That you say the Gomel blessing. I mean, this has definitely happened to me in Shul. Someone says the Gomel blessing. I have no idea why they said it. At least in our show, they don't normally say why this person's saying the Gomel blessing. But then you go up to them and you check in, and you can like give support in a way that you wouldn't, necessarily be able to otherwise. Yeah. Anything else? Like what else would people add in terms of why this blessing is instituted? Yeah, Nancy.
Well, again, it goes back to what I was saying before, that whole thing about being isolated from the community for whatever reason, and now you're being brought back into your community, which is like in Judaism a really big important thing. And so it's acknowledging now that you're coming back to that community that you belong to, and that's pretty important. And you're thanking God for allowing that to happen.
For sure, yeah. I don't actually know who this person is, but I really liked what she wrote, and I like this website ritual. Sometimes it was good stuff. But Rabbi Jennifer Gubitz talks exactly about what you're talking about. Um, um, yeah. You want to read it and why? In other words, why do we all have to respond? You want to read it,
Do you want me
Nancy?
to read it?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
sure.
can read it. It's we will soon have an opportunity. Is that where I'm starting?
Oh,
Or
and why? Do you see it?
and why? Okay,
Yeah.
because I have it on paper. Okay, and why? We all know illness, we all know calamity in various gradations, and we all know the grievous and grief-ridden blow of brokenness, how it is so isolating, how it causes us to feel so alone, how it seems that somehow everyone else's experience improves, but ours, isolated, such that no one else could ever understand our experience. And this is true. We don't know another's experience, and yet we do. We do know. Want to keep going?
Yeah, keep
Brakhot
going.
is a public ritual, as a public response, is our way of saying aloud before God and one another, we know you suffered. We know you felt isolated. We know your family and friends felt this pain too. We felt pain on your behalf. Uh, um, I have it. Okay. And while, is that what's next?
Yeah.
While we don't know exactly, okay, I'm doing off my sheet because I can't read it off that. And while we don't know exactly what it was like for you from our experience, we do know. And because we know, we're here now and we pray for you. We give thanks for you. We celebrate with gratitude the goodness bestowed upon you. And we welcome you back into our midst, healed, or perhaps always healing. Well, that's beautiful.
Yeah, isn't it? I don't know who she is. Oh, actually, I think I looked her up. I think she even lives in the Boston area, possibly. But anyway, I also thought it was beautiful. She also talks about how Birkat Gomel, or maybe it wasn't her, but yes, here from Mishaberach to Birkat Gomel. That Birkat Gomel is like the inverse of Mishaberach. In other words, we are all praying for this person to. We as a community are praying for the person to get better, and then they get better, and we as a community want to mark that together, like that the person we're not, the person is coming back, which I think is also a really beautiful way of talking about it. Yeah. Any other ideas why?
I just have a
Yeah.
one kind of thought. If you look at the
Yeah.
prayer itself, it says Gomel, Tov Yigmalech Kol Tov Selah. Like
Mm.
what is that kol to? All good. And I just think
Yeah, that's very interesting.
it's very,
Yeah.
very interesting. I have just a little thought maybe
Mm-hmm.
that we're telling the person that in the end it's really all good. And you'll see that. You'll see that even this
Mm.
difficulty and distress and suffering is part of a really bigger picture, that somehow you'll see it, that in the end it's really all part of something greater and really good.
Interesting. Right. Because the person doesn't say it. In other words, the person says it's good. They see that it's good, but they don't see that it's all good. Because at the end of the day,
And we say, you should in the future see
right,
God
right,
should
right.
give you only all good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a beautiful interpretation. All right, we have 5 more minutes. So I wanna a little bit. So first of all, I want to end with two sources. One is Rav Melamed, and this gets back to the question, was it Nancy's question? Who was asking about why is it the guilty? Was that your question, Nancy? Yeah. So
Yes.
this is what so this is a very interesting take. It's based on Rev Cook, um, and it also answers the response to Nancy's question. So he says, so remember, Rav Melamed is the one who says practically it's about when something happens that's out of our routine. The routine of daily life often makes it difficult for us to recognize all the goodness that God created in the world. As a result, instead of thanking God, we sometimes complain that it's too hot or too cold, too crowded or too empty, and so on. Right? Like when we're going about our routine lives, most of the time we're not necessarily so appreciative of all the goodness that God does for us. And in fact, the opposite, like we like to complain. But a person who has sailed on a ship, suffered from the waves, and vomited from seasickness, when he returns to dry land, he truly understands how pleasant and good ordinary life is, and he should give thanks to God. Similarly, a person may sometimes feel burdened by social life, which doesn't satisfy him or even oppresses him. Yet, when he wanders in the desert, far from his companions, he realizes how much society protects him, how comfortable and good it is to live within an organized community that provides basic services such as water infrastructure, food stores, commerce, and healthcare. Therefore, when he returns to civilization, he should give thanks. So again, like something about being isolated, right? Isolated from civilization makes us appreciate the blessings of community. And he goes on, and then he ends, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he ends, for this reason, in the wording of the blessing, we say, who bestows goodness upon the undeserving. Okay, that's how they translate it here. Even the other three who recite the Gomer blessing are to some degree considered undeserving, right? Like it's obvious in most cases, not always, but in many of the cases, why someone who's in prison would be considered undeserving. But he's saying even like us normal people, right, are undeserving. Why? Because they too had not fully recognized how much we ought to thank God for the goodness found in everyday life. So in other words, we were undeserving because we weren't really appreciative. And now that we went through this difficult situation, we sort of become more deserving, right? And that now we appreciate routine. We appreciate sort of going back to like the title of this class, right? The blessings of everyday life. And I think Rabbi Sachs really sums it up in it. And I think this is in a lot of ways like what we were talking about all three of the classes, right? Is how saying the blessing in some ways makes us appreciative of normal everyday life, appreciative of the good things and the bad things really in everyday life, right? About about even the fact that we are not self-sufficient and not always in control, and we need other people and we help other people, and the saying the blessing makes us appreciate all these things. And I think, and Rav Sachs sums it up very beautifully. He says, making a blessing over life is the best way of turning life into a blessing, which I think sort of sums up this whole three-part class. And also, like I like to think of what Linda said too, that making, especially this blessing, right, that we say it in front and with the community, right? We're not only making life into a blessing for ourselves, right, but that we're also like bringing in the community in this experience, sort of turning life into a blessing. So that's it for now. Wanted to thank everybody for joining and really offering a lot of excellent and interesting insights. Yeah.
Yes,
Thank
and
you
let us
so much,
know where
Rabbanit
we could
Schultz,
find
and
you.
thank you everyone who joined us for this session. Said it's over, but we'll have more. And thank you so much again, Rabbanit Schultz, and I hope to see all of you in more of our classes here at Drisha.
Great.
להתראות.
Thanks.